Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American presidency. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. The year was 1792 when construction began on what would become the most recognizable symbol of American power, the White House. While the Founding Fathers proclaimed liberty for all, an uncomfortable truth remained hidden in the president's house building records, meticulously kept by overseer Tobias Harding. Among the nameless laborers was Solomon Freeman, whose story lay buried until 1979, when archaeologist Dr. Eleanor Mitchell uncovered a limestone block with crude carvings beneath the East Wing renovation. This discovery would eventually lead researchers to plantation ledgers and personal correspondence, revealing the dark bargain made by the very founders who declared all men are created equal. The limestone block, initially dismissed as unremarkable construction debris by White House historians, revealed under Mitchell's careful examination crude but deliberate markings, the initials SF, accompanied by a primitive etching resembling broken chains, that defied the official narrative, maintained for nearly 2 centuries. Mitchell's preliminary report suggesting investigation into possible contributions by enslaved craftsmen met immediate institutional resistance. Her department head at the Smithsonian warned that such speculations could be deemed politically motivated, while White House officials denied her requests to examine sealed architectural archives, citing preservation protocols never before invoked for academic research. The systematic obstruction only strengthened Mitchell's determination, leading her to pursue alternative channels through the National Archives, where, after months of bureaucratic maneuvering and the assistance of a sympathetic archivist nearing retirement, she gained access to uncatalogued correspondence recovered after the 1814 burning of the Executive Mansion. Among these fragile, smoke-damaged papers lay partial ledgers and personal letters belonging to Tobias Harding, whose meticulous documentation of property laborers provided the first concrete evidence that hundreds of enslaved individuals had been systematically used in the construction while being deliberately omitted from official records. Their horrifying living conditions, described with clinical detachment that did nothing to disguise the reality of dawn to dusk labor, insufficient rations, punishments, and an alarming mortality rate. The year 1792 marked a pivotal moment in the fledgling American democracy as President George Washington and the 3 appointed commissioners of the Federal District, Thomas Johnson, David Stewart, and Daniel Carroll, announced the selection of James Hoban's neoclassical design for the President's House, following a widely publicized architectural competition. The winning design, modeled after Dublin's Leinster House, was celebrated in the Philadelphia Gazette as a monument to American ingenuity and craftsmanship that would embody the young republic's highest ideals of freedom and democratic governance. Public proclamations heralded the future mansion as built by the hands of American artisans, while ceremonial speeches during the cornerstone laying emphasized the symbolic importance of constructing a home worthy of the nation's highest office through the honest labor of patriotic citizens. Yet recently discovered private correspondence between Washington and Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, reveals calculated discussions on how to reduce the project's substantial costs, with Jefferson writing candidly, "The employment of the neighboring plantations' Negroes presents the most economical solution without requiring congressional appropriations that might alarm the public." The commissioners subsequently established an every times of congressions elaborate system of documentation whereby plantation owners from Virginia and Maryland would lease their enslaved workers to the government for specified periods, receiving payment directly while the laborers themselves earned nothing for their dangerous and exhausting work. The accounting ledgers, meticulously maintained by Treasury officials, recorded these transactions with deliberate vagueness, listing payments to various plantation owners for contracted services and temporary labor provisions, without explicitly mentioning the status of the payments workers provided. This carefully constructed paper trail allowed the commissioners to report to Congress that construction costs were being managed efficiently, while obscuring the morally uncomfortable reality that the symbol of American liberty was being built by those who had no freedom themselves. In a particularly revealing letter to the commissioners dated August 1792, Washington himself instructed that public acknowledgement of the labor source might unnecessarily complicate the narrative we wish to establish regarding our new seat of government, effectively ordering the creation of a sporadically historical fiction that would persist for generations, and establishing a pattern of deliberate omission that would characterize the official history of the White House for nearly 2 centuries. By early spring of 1792, over 400 enslaved individuals had been forcibly transported from plantations across Virginia and Maryland to the marshy grounds of the future capital city. Their arrival documented in Tobias Harding's meticulous records as merely property received for federal works project. Among these men, women, and children were master craftsmen whose sophisticated skills had been developed over lifetimes of forced labor. Stonemasons who had constructed elaborate plantation homes throughout the Chesapeake region, carpenters whose precision joinery graced Virginia's finest estates, and bricklayers whose techniques had been passed down through generations of enslaved artisans. Plantation inventories and census records examined by Dr. Mitchell revealed the calculated selection process, with Washington's farm manager writing to neighboring plantation owners requesting the loan of any Negroes possessed of superior skills in the building trades, specifying that they should be of robust constitution and no more than 40 years in age. The transportation records show these skilled individuals were marched in chains or transported by cart to the federal district, often separated from family members with no indication of when or if they would return. A recently discovered ledger belonging to Dr. William Thornton, one of the commissioners who had medical training, contains disturbing health assessments of the newly arrived workers, clinically noting their physical conditions with the dispassionate eye of someone evaluating livestock. Male specimen approximately 30 years, muscular development suitable for stonework, evidence of previous whipping but otherwise sound. And Negro male, 25 to 27 years, skilled carpenter according to owner, slight cough indicating possible consumption to monitor as work progresses. The medical examinations, conducted in a makeshift tent near the construction site, evaluated the enslaved workers' capacity for hard labor rather than addressing their health needs, with Thornton noting in his private correspondence that some specimens show signs of overuse from previous service, but most appear capable of withstanding the demands of our ambitious timeline. These clinical observations, made at the outset of the 8-year construction project, would prove grimly prophetic as the physical toll of building the president's house in Washington's swampy, disease-ridden environment would claim dozens of lives, deaths documented only as reductions in available workforce, requiring replacement acquisitions from nearby plantations, their bodies buried in unmarked graves that would remain undiscovered for more than a century. Tobias Harding's accounting books, recovered from the National Archives in fragments, and later supplemented by volumes discovered in his descendants' Virginia attic in 1991, reveal an operation managed with cold efficiency and bureaucratic precision that masked the human suffering beneath the statistical columns. The daily logs meticulously documented each worker by owner, assigned task, materials used, and productivity measured against expected quotas, with clinical notations for discipline administered, appearing with disturbing frequency throughout the 8-year construction period. Entries such as, the 16th of July 1793, 15 lashes administered to Nero, property of Mr. Collins, for insufficient daily progress on North Portico stonework, and September 4, 1794, rations reduced for 7 laborers, various owners, failing to complete foundation section within allocated time, appear alongside production figures reported to the commissioners. Harding's official correspondence portrays him as the model overseer, writing to Commissioner Carroll that maximum efficiency is maintained through appropriate motivational measures, but his private journals, discovered by his great-great-granddaughter Rebecca Harding Davis, during a home renovation, reveal a man increasingly troubled by his role, writing in 1795. I find myself unable to sleep as the methods necessary to maintain our schedule weigh heavily upon my conscience. Yet I cannot falter in my duties without risking my position and reputation. These private misgivings never translated to systemic changes, however, as the pressure from Washington and the commissioners to complete the mansion on schedule and under budget superseded humanitarian concerns. Providing crucial outside perspective on these conditions was Philip Henderson, a free black artisan hired to create ornamental plasterwork, whose secretly maintained diary was preserved by his family and donated to Howard University in 1867. Henderson's accounts describe the reality behind Harding's sterile records. The poor souls labor from before dawn until past dusk, their backs bearing fresh wounds, their hands bloodied, yet they somehow maintain dignity through shared hymns whispered at night and small acts of defiance hidden from the overseer's eye. Henderson documented how Solomon Freeman would carve nearly imperceptible marks into stonework, tiny symbols of resistance that would survive long after the workers themselves were forgotten, creating what Henderson called a secret history written in stone by those whose stories the powerful would erase from memory. While the construction site in the Federal District demonstrated the harsh realities of forced labor, conditions at the Aquia Creek quarries in Stafford County, Virginia, where the sandstone for the White House was extracted, revealed an even darker chapter of suffering largely absent from historical records until Dr. Mitchell's research unearthed the quarry operation ledgers. The distinctive creamy white sandstone that would give the executive mansion its appearance before it was painted required extraction from deep quarry pits, where enslaved laborers worked in suffocating conditions, suspended on precarious wooden platforms as they cut massive blocks weighing several tons using primitive tools and dangerous black powder explosions. Parish death records from nearby St. Paul's Church, cross-referenced with Harding's quarry workforce registries, reveal the alarming human cost. Between 1792 and 1795, 38 enslaved quarry workers perished from rockfall accidents, explosions gone awry, exhaustion, or the mysterious quarry fever that periodically swept through the squalid worker cabins where men were chained together at night to prevent escape attempts. A particularly illuminating document discovered in the French diplomatic archives in 2002 provides the only eyewitness account from an outside observer, Jean-Pierre Simon, a junior diplomat who visited the quarries in August 1793 while touring the new capital's development. His confidential report to the French Foreign Ministry, never intended for American eyes, expressed horror at what he witnessed. The conditions under which these unfortunate souls labor would shock the conscience of any civilized observer, with men covered in stone dust working beyond human endurance, their bodies displaying evidence of frequent punishment, several with festering wounds unattended, all while armed overseers maintained constant vigilance. Simon further noted that, when one man collapsed from apparent heat exposure, he was simply dragged away and another put in his place with no interruption to the work. Concluding that the magnificent stones destined to house American democracy are extracted at a cost of misery that contradicts all the noble principles this new nation professes to uphold. This damning report was subsequently removed from copies of French diplomatic correspondence provided to American officials following a formal complaint about Simon's unauthorized visit to the quarry, ensuring that this rare outside perspective on the operation would remain buried in Paris archives for over 2 centuries. Among the hundreds of enslaved laborers who built the president's house, the stonemason Solomon Freeman emerges from historical shadows as a figure of quiet but persistent resistance, his defiance documented in overseer records and physical evidence discovered during successive White House renovations. Harding's disciplinary ledger contains multiple entries regarding Solomon, described as craftsman of superior skill but dangerous disposition, with notations of punishment for increasingly serious infractions. The 17th of August, 1793. 10 lashes administered to Solomon, property of Mount Vernon estate, for unauthorized markings on cornerstone materials. followed by the 3rd of October 1793. 20 lashes and 3 days without rations for Solomon following discovery of further carvings on interior structural stones. These punishments did nothing to deter Solomon's determination to leave his mark, as modern scanning technology has revealed dozens of hidden signatures, symbols, and messages throughout the White House's original stonework. Small, nearly imperceptible markings in locations that would be covered by finishing materials, but remain part of the building's structural skeleton. Dr. Mitchell's research uncovered the most poignant evidence of Solomon's motivation: a letter written to his wife Dinah, from whom he had been separated when Washington selected him for the federal project. Intercepted by Harding in 1794 but preserved among the overseer's personal papers. The partially damaged letter, written in a surprisingly refined hand that testified to Solomon's self-education despite prohibitions against literacy among enslaved people, reads in part, "They may own my body for now, but they cannot own what my hands create. Each stone I lay contains marks they will never find, and long after you and I return to dust, the work of my hands will remain. When future generations look upon this house, they may not know my name, but I was here, I existed, and no amount of their historical forgetting can erase that truth." Harding's diary indicates that following the letter's interception, Solomon received 50 lashes and was placed in iron restraints while working. Yet subsequent White House renovations have continued to uncover new evidence of his hidden resistance, with the most recent discovery in 2021 revealing a perfectly preserved carving behind a cornerstone reading simply, "Solomon Freeman built this wall, 1795. A defiant claim of authorship from a man whose contribution history attempted to erase. The summer of 1795 brought devastating consequences to the White House construction site, as a malaria outbreak swept through the inadequate worker housing, claiming the lives of dozens of enslaved laborers whose bodies were hastily interred in unmarked graves near what would later become Lafayette Square. Harding's ledgers document this period with disturbing detachment, noting on the 28th of July 1795, 7 laborers deceased from swamp fever this week, production on North Portico delayed. Requested replacements from Virginia plantations to maintain schedule, followed by similar entries throughout August and September as the death toll mounted. The systematic recording of human losses as mere productivity interruptions stands in stark contrast to a remarkable letter discovered in the personal papers of Congressman Fisher Ames, written by an anonymous government clerk who witnessed the disposal of the dead. "I can scarcely put into words the barbarous scene I observed yesterday morning, where the bodies of no fewer than 9 Negro workers, victims of the rampant fever, were deposited in a common trench, with less ceremony than one might afford a favorite horse. No prayers were spoken, no markers placed, and by afternoon the same ground was trampled by carts bringing materials to the site, as if these souls had never existed at all. This rare expression of contemporary moral outrage was never made public, the clerk apparently fearing professional repercussions from documenting what he called a stain upon our national honor that surely must someday be accounted for. For more than 2 centuries, the physical evidence of this atrocity remained hidden beneath the manicured grounds near the White House until 2008, when archaeological investigations employing ground-penetrating radar technology revealed the unmistakable presence of mass graves containing an estimated 60 to 70 individuals in an area now covered by Lafayette Square's northeast quadrant. Soil samples extracted during the non-invasive study confirmed high concentrations of femoral and cranial fragments, while items recovered from test sites included crude metal buttons, glass beads, and a hand-carved wooden pipe, humble personal effects buried with individuals whose names went unrecorded by the government they died building. The National Park Service's subsequent report recommended preserving these burial grounds in place rather than disturbing them further, concluding that these remains constitute an archaeological site of profound historical significance that transforms our understanding of how and by whom the White House was built. November 1800 marked the frantic final phase of the President's house construction as the deadline for President John Adams' arrival approached, with Commissioner William Thornton writing urgently to Harding that no excuses will be tolerated for delays, regardless of weather conditions or worker limitations. The pressure to complete at least the essential portions of the mansion resulted in round-the-clock labor, with Harding's records documenting that enslaved workers were kept at their tasks for up to 18 hours daily during the final 6 weeks, with several collapsing from exhaustion and 2 falling to their deaths from scaffolding, incidents recorded merely as unfortunate accidents causing minor delays, while only 6 of the planned 30 rooms were completed when Adams took residence on the 1st of November, 1800. The public narrative celebrated the achievement while carefully avoiding mention of who had built the structure. Adams' public statements praised the fine American craftsmanship of the mansion, yet his private correspondence tells a different story, as revealed in a recently discovered letter to his son Thomas, where he acknowledged, "The house has been built primarily through the labor of the enslaved, a fact which creates some discomfort as I contemplate the principles of our revolution, yet seems to be the established practice in this new capital." Most revealing is a household inventory document dated the 28th of October 1800, discovered in the Adams family papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which lists 8 Negro servants transferred from construction service to household duties, providing the first documented connection between the enslaved construction workers and those who would serve within the completed mansion. Among these names is Jasper, formerly under Mr. Harding's direction, skilled in carpentry and general repairs, indicating that individuals with particular skills were retained to maintain the very building they had constructed, transitioning from construction slavery to household slavery without ever experiencing freedom. The document represents a critical link in understanding how the exploitation of enslaved people evolved from the building's construction to its daily operation, demonstrating that while the narrative of the White House as a symbol of democracy was being crafted for the public, the reality remained founded on human bondage. The historical erasure of enslaved contributions to the White House began systematically following the mansion's burning during the War of 1812, when rebuilding efforts presented the perfect opportunity to rewrite the narrative of its original construction. A remarkable document discovered in Treasury Department archives reveals a directive dated the 17th of March, 1815, from Secretary of State James Monroe to the Reconstruction Committee, instructing that all records pertaining to the original construction be thoroughly reviewed and sanitized of any references that might prove politically embarrassing or inconsistent with the dignity of the executive residence. This directive coincided with the appointment of Irish immigrant James Hoban, the original architect, to oversee the rebuilding, allowing officials to emphasize his role while minimizing documentation of the labor force. By 1816, payment records had been selectively preserved, retaining only those showing transactions with contractors and material suppliers, while eliminating the more detailed labor records that had documented the use of enslaved workers. The most damaging blow to historical truth came in 1847, when historian William Crawford produced the first comprehensive history of the Executive Mansion, the President's House. A history commissioned by President Polk as part of efforts to establish proper historical records of important national buildings. Crawford's extensively researched work examined architectural plans, presidential papers, and construction records, yet contains not a single reference to enslaved labor, instead attributing the construction to skilled immigrant artisans and local craftsmen of considerable talent. Correspondence between Crawford and Interior Department officials reveals deliberate editorial decisions, with Assistant Secretary Thompson writing, "The narrative should emphasize the architectural achievement and symbolic importance of the structure without dwelling on divisive aspects of its creation that might inflame current political tensions." Crawford's account, widely accepted as authoritative and used as the basis for subsequent histories for over a century, represented the final step in a coordinated effort to disassociate the national symbol from the institution of slavery, an erasure so complete that even after abolition, the connection remained largely unexamined by historians. This sanitized narrative became embedded in educational materials, tourist information, and official White House histories, ensuring that generations of Americans would learn about the mansion's neoclassical design and presidential occupants, while remaining entirely unaware of the hundreds of enslaved individuals whose forced labor and expertise had created the physical embodiment of the American presidency. The extensive renovation of the White House ordered by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1901 inadvertently unearthed physical evidence of the building's suppressed history when workers excavating beneath the East Terrace discovered human remains alongside personal effects indicative of enslaved laborers from the original construction period. Project foreman Charles McKim's official daily reports make no mention of these findings, but a confidential memorandum discovered in the Roosevelt presidential papers reveals that McKim privately informed the president of the discovery, writing that excavation has revealed what appear to be human skeletal remains, accompanied by items suggesting these individuals were among the Negro workforce employed during initial construction. The memorandum continues, with a recommendation that would ensure continued historical erasure. Given the sensitive nature of this discovery and the potential for unnecessary complications to the historical record of this important national symbol, I recommend immediate and discreet reburial of these remains at an alternate location, with no official documentation of the finding. Roosevelt's handwritten note in the margin, "Proceed as recommended with utmost discretion," authorized this cover-up, and subsequent renovation reports contain no reference to the discovery. The incident would have remained completely buried were it not for a remarkable personal letter written by Michael Callahan, an Irish immigrant stonemason working on the renovation, to his wife in Boston, describing what the official record omitted. "Today we made a most disturbing discovery beneath the east portion of the house, the bones of what our foreman says were slaves who built the original house. With them were crude tools, a carved wooden button, and what appeared to be a small pouch containing a smooth stone and braided hair, some small treasure carried by a soul now forgotten. By afternoon, these poor souls were gone, carted away, and we were instructed never to speak of it." This letter, preserved in Callahan's family Bible until its discovery in 2010, provides crucial evidence of both the physical presence of enslaved laborers' remains and the deliberate institutional decision to continue suppressing this history. While official histories remained sanitized for generations, the truth of the White House's construction survived through oral traditions within African American families, preserved through storytelling despite systematic attempts to erase their ancestors' contributions. The Federal Writers' Project of 1937, which documented the experiences of formerly enslaved people during the Great Depression, inadvertently captured several accounts from elderly individuals whose grandparents had worked on the president's house construction, creating an invaluable alternative historical record. Interviews conducted in Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia included testimonies from Martha Jefferson, age 88, who recounted her grandmother's vivid descriptions of the White House construction camp. Grandmama told how they slept in rough wood shelters no better than animal pens, worked from before sunrise till after dark, and how the overseers would whip any man who slowed down, even those burning with fever. Similar details emerged from William Henson, age 91, who recalled his grandfather's accounts of the quarry work. Granddaddy carried the scars on his back till he died, said the stone dust filled their lungs so they coughed blood, and how they lost 8 men when a platform collapsed but they just brought in more slaves the next day. Rebecca Taylor's interview described how her great-grandfather Solomon had carved little marks into the stones so someday people would know a black man built that house, a detail that precisely matched the archaeological evidence discovered decades later. Most remarkably, these oral histories, collected independently across different states from individuals with no contact with each other, contained strikingly consistent details about working conditions, punishment practices, and specific incidents that later corroborated information in Harding's ledgers, lending powerful credibility to both sources. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell's comparative analysis of these testimonies against the documentary evidence revealed remarkable alignment in chronology, specific event descriptions, and even naming patterns of overseers and workers, proving that the oral tradition had faithfully preserved historical truths that official records had attempted to obliterate. The preservation of these accounts represents a form of resistance against historical erasure, as generations of families maintained their ancestors' stories despite the government's systematic efforts to rewrite the narrative of the White House's creation. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell's quest to recover the identities of the enslaved builders began as a painstaking reconstruction of fragmented historical evidence, piecing together names deliberately scattered across disparate records, never meant to be reconnected. The methodology she developed required cross-referencing plantation inventories, where skilled workers were listed as valuable property, with Treasury Department payment records showing compensation to specific plantation owners for labor services rendered to the federal district. Church burial records from parishes surrounding the construction site yielded additional names, as did court documents from several runaway slave cases originating at the President's House worksite between 1792 and 1798. Mitchell's preliminary list of 87 individuals represented merely a fraction of the estimated workforce, but even this partial restoration challenged the historical erasure that had denied these builders their rightful place in American history. The breakthrough that transformed the research came in 2005, when a leather-bound notebook was discovered during the renovation of a historic Georgetown home once owned by Philip Henderson's descendants. This remarkable document, maintained in secret despite prohibitions against literacy among Black Americans, contained Henderson's meticulous documentation of over 200 enslaved individuals working alongside him between 1793 and 1798. Henderson had recorded not only names but also skills, plantation origins, family connections when known, and in some cases, the specific elements of the White House each person had crafted. The registry included entries such as Joshua, master carpenter from Arlington Plantation, carved the main stair banister and says he has wife and 3 children he has not seen in 2 years, and Eliza, plastered the ceiling medallions in the East Room, came from Maryland, speaks French and English, lost 2 fingers to frostbite winter of '94. Henderson's extraordinary act of witness, maintained at great personal risk, provided the most comprehensive record of the White House builders' identities and preserved details of their humanity that official documents deliberately omitted. When combined with Mitchell's previously gathered evidence, the registry enabled the identification of 287 individuals, still incomplete, but a profound reclamation of identity for those whose contributions had been systematically erased from the historical record, transforming nameless laborers into specific people with skills, histories, and connections whose craftsmanship created the executive mansion. In April 2015, what began as routine utility excavation for a security upgrade along Pennsylvania Avenue unexpectedly transformed into a significant historical discovery when workers uncovered artifacts unmistakably connected to the White House's enslaved builders. The initial finds, a broken stoneworking tool, glass trade beads, and a clay pipe with West African decorative motifs, prompted the National Park Service to conduct emergency archaeological assessment, revealing personal effects, including a hand-carved button, shackle fragments, and a leather pouch containing a stone inscribed with Adinkra symbols from Africa. The archaeological team, led by Dr. Marcus Johnson, employed ground-penetrating radar to survey the surrounding area, identifying multiple subsurface anomalies consistent with human burial sites extending from Lafayette Square toward the North Lawn. Soil core samples confirmed the presence of human remains, placing federal authorities in a difficult position as laws governing treatment of human remains intersected with the politically sensitive nature of these discoveries. The findings generated immediate tension between scholars advocating for comprehensive excavation versus officials concerned about disrupting the official White House narrative. Internal memoranda revealed debate about whether to proceed with minimal investigation necessary for security installation or conduct comprehensive archaeological recovery. Congressional Black Caucus members pressed for full investigation and public acknowledgement, while resistance came from those arguing such excavation would be disruptive to the executive mansion and potentially create unnecessary historical controversies. Dr. Johnson's team ultimately recommended a limited recovery operation followed by in situ preservation with appropriate memorialization, concluding that these remains represent individuals whose contributions to our national story have been systematically erased, demanding acknowledgement and incorporation into our understanding of how America's most iconic building came into being. On a crisp autumn morning in September 2017, over 300 individuals from across America gathered on the National Mall, their diverse appearances belying a profound shared heritage as descendants of those who had built the White House under bondage. The unprecedented gathering, organized through a combination of genealogical research, DNA database connections, and social media outreach, brought together families who had preserved oral histories of their ancestors' forced contributions to the executive mansion across generations of deliberate historical erasure. 78-year-old Martha Coleman from Virginia held up a hand-carved wooden button passed down through 5 generations, remarkably similar to artifacts recovered in the 2015 excavation, explaining how her great-great-grandfather Thomas had secretly taken it from the construction site as proof of his presence there. James Henson from Maryland shared letters written by his ancestor in the 1,850 seconds describing his grandfather's stonework on the White House portico, while the Wilson family presented a carefully preserved journal containing descriptions of construction techniques used by their forebear, a skilled carpenter forced to work on the mansion's intricate interior woodwork. The gathering took on additional scientific weight when geneticist Dr. Alicia Rogers presented findings from DNA analysis of remains recovered during the 2015 excavation, confirming biological connections to 17 families present, including direct lineage to Sarah Jackson, whose great-great-great-grandfather Solomon Freeman's carved initials had first sparked Dr. Mitchell's investigation decades earlier. The collective testimonies created what historian Dr. Raymond Carter described as a human tapestry of remembrance that fundamentally challenges the sanitized narrative of American founding mythology, forcing public acknowledgement of how the nation's most iconic symbol of democracy had been created by those denied its basic promises. White House Historical Association President Lawrence Montgomery, who had initially opposed the 2015 excavation, addressed the gathering with a remarkable shift in institutional position. Your ancestors' stories belong at the center, not the margins, of how we understand and present the White House to future generations. This building stands not just as a symbol of presidential power, but as testimony to skills and sacrifices that our nation has for too long failed to honor. On a rain-soaked morning in April 2022, after decades of academic research, archaeological evidence, and persistent advocacy from descendants and historians alike, the formal acknowledgement of the White House's enslaved builders finally materialized in an official ceremony attended by the President, congressional leaders, and over 500 descendants of those whose forced labor had created the executive mansion. The installation of a permanent bronze plaque in the East Wing listed 287 names recovered through Dr. Mitchell's research and Philip Henderson's registry, each name representing an individual whose contribution had been deliberately erased from American history for over 2 centuries. The plaque's solemn inscription, in recognition of the enslaved craftspeople and laborers whose skill, expertise, and involuntary sacrifice built this house of American democracy between 1792 and 1800, represented what historian Dr. Carter called not the conclusion but merely the beginning of historical reckoning. The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Sarah Jackson, great-great-great-granddaughter of Solomon Freeman, was escorted to the limestone block where her ancestors' carvings had been discovered in 1979, now permanently displayed in a specially designed exhibit space. As she placed her hand on the stone surface her ancestor had shaped over 2 centuries earlier, the physical connection between past and present visibly moved even the most stoic officials present. My ancestor found a way to ensure he would not be forgotten, even as an entire system worked to erase him, Jackson observed in her remarks. But for every Solomon Freeman whose mark was preserved, hundreds of others remain nameless, their contributions unmarked, their stories still buried. The commemorative plaque and exhibition represented meaningful progress, yet highlighted how much remains irrecoverable. No documentation exists for an estimated 2/3 of those who built the White House, their identities lost to deliberate historical erasure. As the ceremony concluded with the unveiling of plans for a more comprehensive memorial to be constructed on the White House grounds, the president acknowledged the partial nature of this historical justice. Today we take one step toward truth, recognizing that complete restoration of these forgotten Americans to their rightful place in history remains an unfinished journey that our nation must continue to pursue.